Hello, everyone. The 16th century saw the rise of theater as a popular form of entertainment. Before this, theatrical productions were relegated to holidays, religious festivals, or private performances for kings and those who could afford to host acting companies. As acting companies became more popular, they had the capital to build permanent theaters where they could charge anyone to watch their performances. Anyone who could afford the cheapest price could see the same plays that were performed in front of royalty. And so, the theater is a unique form of entertainment for the early modern period. In this presentation, I'll introduce the elements of tragedy, the early modern theater, and one of Shakespeare's most famous tragedies, Macbeth. Let's get started. First, we'll start with defining tragedy. For Shakespeare and his contemporaries, Aristotle is the person who provided the working definition of tragedy. The following definition comes from Aristotle's classic work, Poetry, which Shakespeare would have read while in school. A tragedy is the imitation of an action that is serious and also as having magnitude, complete in itself, in language with pleasurable accessories, which arouses pity and fear wherewith to accomplish its catharsis of such emotions. For Aristotle, action is the key. Tragedy is essentially an imitation not of persons, but of action and life, of happiness and misery. The action involves agents who must necessarily have their distinctive qualities both of character and thought, since it is from these that we ascribe certain qualities to their actions. In other words, tragedy's goal is to make people better than the characters on stage. In short, the key terms for tragedy include magnitude, fear and pity, and catharsis. When using the term magnitude, Aristotle is referring to great people performing great actions. This in turn results in great consequences, hence most tragedies involve people in positions of great power. But more than that, the tragic characters are also supposed to be great people. They're supposed to be exemplars of whichever place in society they hold. The tragedy is in watching a great person fall. A tragic character is supposed to arouse both fear and pity. That is, we are meant to be afraid and to feel sympathy for the character throughout the play. Typically, this comes from the character's hamartia, that is, their error in judgment. Hamartia is sometimes referred to as a character's fatal flaw. Translators have discovered that this is an imprecise understanding of the word. It's closer to a mistake in judgment more than a character's flaw. Although most students tend to be familiar with the last term here, catharsis, it is still a good idea to review it. Catharsis is a purging of emotions, specifically the emotions elicited from the play's actions. For instance, if the play has elicited anger and revenge within the audience, then the play is supposed to release those emotions so that the audience members no longer feel them. Theatrical performances were not limited to just public theaters. There were at least 3 different types of theatrical spaces, including court theaters, where companies performed for the king or queen, private theaters, where traveling companies performed at private residences, and the public theaters, where anyone could afford it could watch the performance. The first public theater was built in London around 1576 and signaled a shift in theater as a profitable enterprise. Performance was no longer bound to a religious and official calendar, it was permitted on work days as well as calendar holidays. Despite these changes, theaters and the players who performed there were not viewed as reputable. The theaters were only allowed outside the London city limits, near brothels, bear-baiting houses, and other disreputable institutions. It wasn't unusual for prostitutes and pickpockets to frequent theaters to practice their trades. The first theaters to be built were the Theater, the Curtain, and the Rose. The Globe was built around 1598. Unfortunately, the original Globe burned to the ground due to a cannon misfire in 1613. The current Globe has been built to resemble as closely as possible the original. In the pictures on this slide, notice how the people closest to the stage are standing. In Shakespeare's time, these were the cheap seats, and the people who stood to watch plays were called groundlings. Funnily enough, today, these are the most sought-after seats at the Globe. Theaters at the time did not use electricity, and candles were both expensive and dangerous, so they were constructed to take advantage of the afternoon sun when most performances took place. The stages were mostly bare, using only a minimal number of set pieces. The scene was set by the writers, which explains why characters in Shakespeare's plays spend so much time describing the world around them. They are setting the scene for the audience's imagination. The stage itself is split into three distinct sections: Hell, the trapdoor beneath the stage; Earth, the stage and the upper balcony; and the heavens, the roof that covers the stage. Each of these sections has significant meaning in terms of staging. For instance, in Titus Andronicus, many characters in dead bodies find themselves descending into the underworld through the trapdoor. Meanwhile, royal figures will enter the stage space via the balcony. Their height above everyone else signifies their powerful, authoritative social status. Other characters, like Juliet and Romeo and Juliet, in the balcony appear in the balcony because they are more heavenly than the other characters who are closer to the earth. Written in 1606, Macbeth is considered one of Shakespeare's best tragedies, one of the big four, which includes Hamlet, Othello, and King Lear. While Thomas Middleton probably contributed some scenes, including the Hecate scene, Shakespeare is responsible for most of the play. Shakespeare also contributed some scenes and/or speeches in other plays. Writers frequently collaborate on each other's plays. For Macbeth, Shakespeare seems to have written a tragedy tailor-made for Elizabeth I's appointed successor, King James I, who was obsessed with the occult, witches, and treason. The story comes from Raphael Holinshed's Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland, so Macbeth was a king of Scotland. However, we must be careful not to confuse Shakespeare's version of history. He shapes history for theatrical and thematic reasons. In short, do not take Macbeth for strict history, but as an interpretation of history formed by Shakespeare's contemporary situation. Shakespeare, as demonstrated in his history plays, is fascinated with cycles of violence. Notice how the play begins and ends with a beheading. As for the story, Macbeth is set in the 11th century Scotland. King Duncan and his followers, thanks in large part to Macbeth, have violently put down a rebellion. Macbeth is rewarded for his efforts. Meanwhile, three witches meet Macbeth and Banquo to inform them of their fortunes. Macbeth will be king, and Banquo's sons will be kings. Macbeth, spurred on by his wife Lady Macbeth, decides to murder the king and take the throne. The rest of the play follows Macbeth's attempts to consolidate his power through violence. As Macbeth dives further and further into violence, he and Lady Macbeth experience severe psychological and supernatural effects. Moreover, their marriage, so unified at the beginning of the play, dissolves as Macbeth refuses to communicate his plans to her and as she realizes the all-consuming monster she has unleashed on Scotland. Some of the themes we'll discuss include the following: ambition, cycles of violence and trauma, marriage, masculinity, unrestrained consumption, look for eating metaphors that can be taken both literally and figuratively, hosts and the breaking of etiquette required of a host, and parents and their children. Macbeth himself claims vaulting ambition as the source of his distemper. However, is ambition the sole cause for what happens? What about the witches? What kind of role do they play? After all, would Macbeth and his wife have vaulted themselves onto the throne if the witches hadn't predicted it? The play starts and begins with the rebellion. The first is unsuccessful. What kind of message could the play be sending to the new king? Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, despite their penchant for violence, have one of the most successful marriages in Shakespeare's canon. What makes their marriage work? Lady Macbeth spurs her husband to kill Duncan by questioning his manhood. Other characters, including Macduff and Malcolm, address qualities of manliness. What could the play be suggesting about masculinity and its toxic traits? In another tied to ambition and greed, the characters refer to unrestrained consumption, and so look for eating metaphors. In the Patrick Stewart version of Macbeth, there is a great scene where he is making a sandwich while discussing murder. It's brilliant. Speaking of the Macbeths, early modern culture still believed in the ancient protections of hosting. If you ate and drank beneath a person's roof, you were under their protection. The Macbeths break this tradition by murdering their guest, Duncan. And finally, The play contains parents and children who become important to the plot. In this regard, it's important to note kings and queens, mostly after Elizabeth I, who started the trend, speaking of themselves as mothers or fathers to their subjects. What could the play be suggesting about the relationships between parents and children, and kings and their subjects? Thank you for watching, and please let me know if you have any questions.